Good afternoon and a big welcome to the beautiful Concert Noble here in Brussels for an afternoon of discussion and debate entitled Powering Europe's Digital Decade, Competitiveness, Recovery and Resilience, brought to you by Politico Live in partnership with Vodafone. My name is Samuel Stolten. I'm a reporter at Politico Europe covering tech and competition, and I'll be opening this afternoon's event where we'll discuss everything from the EU's digital decade targets to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, from the bloc's recently adopted Digital Markets Act and the negotiations on the Digital Services Act, as well as how the bloc's recovery funds might be leveraged to usher in a new era of digitalization in Europe. For this cause, we have a stellar lineup for you, including a one-on-one interview with the EU Commission's Executive Vice President, Margrethe Vestager, as well as several panel sessions later in the afternoon featuring high-level political officials as well as industry representatives. But before we get into all that, a few housekeeping remarks. Firstly, a big thank you to Vodafone for making this event possible, and likewise, many thank you to our audience here in person. It's great to see real human beings in the flesh once again, and it even puts me at more ease looking out towards the audience today and not seeing a one Will Smith out there, which you know, there are fears that often these things may jump on you at the last minute, but indeed, no Will Smith at today's event, thank goodness. But of course, we also have those of you tuning in online, and we'd like to make the event as interactive as possible with the new hybrid format. So please submit your questions via Slido, that's sli.do, using the Powering the Decade hashtag. When submitting your questions, please make sure to supply your name and representation also. Do also join the debate on Twitter by using the hashtag Powering the Decade and the handle LivePolitico. And please don't forget as well to make sure that you have a clear profile and we know your representation on Twitter too. Without further ado, I think it's just about time to turn to some opening remarks now from our partner Vodafone. And for this cause, I'd like to turn to the company's CEO, Nick Reed.
Samuel, that was a lot of instructions you went through in a very fast order. So, look, good afternoon, and thank you for all taking the time to spend with us going through these very important subjects that we want to cover. This event is even more important given the current war in Ukraine and the security crisis we face. The digital decade, the pace and nature of our digitalization will be a crucial factor in the future of Europe. So I'm really glad that we've been able to convene this event today. The war in Ukraine and Europe's security crisis has exposed some important vulnerabilities in Europe. First and foremost, there is a humanitarian crisis to deal with. Importantly, the pandemic crisis provided a key learning for us. It taught us that public and private sector can rally quickly together at pace. At Vodafone, we have mobilized a response team supporting our partner within the Ukraine, helping refugee camps with connectivity and almost 300,000 free SIMs, free roaming, free international calling. And I know that it's a small contribution to what is a huge crisis that we face across Europe, but Vodafone wants to play its part. So in the same way, that accelerated digitalization that was a key component of the COVID recovery and building back better, now security and resilience becomes critical for Europe to address. I believe that Europe's digital decade now becomes even more important due to the war in Ukraine and the security crisis. We already know that 5G and the digital transformation could enhance European economic competitiveness. There is a potential 2.2 trillion euros of GDP contribution by 2030 from digital technologies, a key support to our economic growth. It will also be an enabler of inclusion and the fair distribution of that economic growth. Innovations we're working on include e-health, e-education, available to all. And importantly, SMEs, who are the beating heart of Europe's economy, can also materially benefit from digitalization. The European Commission has already identified the link between the digital transformation and the green transformation. Global emissions can reduce by 15% with the deployment of technology. But over and above this, we must now ensure that the digital decade that we enable is one that also enhances Europe's security and resilience, one based on strong, scaled European telco and tech players who are committed to develop a secure and resilient digital ecosystem. And Vodafone is uniquely positioned to play a key role. We are deploying 5G currently across 250 European cities using the combination of local scale and regional capabilities, including 800 cybersecurity experts that ensure our European network stays secure. And we're investing in a new European tech hub in Malaga with 600 engineers working on a variety of really critical ecosystem projects, including Open RAN. On top of this, we're building regional scale platforms to industrialize European digital platforms and solutions at pace. Our IoT platform, built in Europe, connects 140 million devices in 180 countries. It's a platform that we are evolving from the Internet of Things to the economy of things, from seamless connectivity to seamless transactions. We recently announced our new digital asset broker platform, where we're partnering with a number of companies to simplify EV charging throughout Europe, enabling that green transition. And there are other solutions that we are deploying that are actually demonstrated in the showcase behind us. From energy reducing consumption from smart city solutions to increasing agricultural output with less fertilizer. Please take the time to view all of the examples that you see here today. You all know Vodafone as a provider of connectivity, but post this showcase, I want you to see us as a key European tech company developing solutions and platforms with partners that go way beyond connectivity. To achieve the digital decade goals and stay globally competitive, there needs to be the ability to work together, the public and private sector in partnership. I want to acknowledge the incredible work of the European institutes in terms of the relationship and the deployment of the European Recovery Fund. I mean, I think it's been a fantastic initiative done at pace. That pace in getting funds put in place in each of the countries now needs to be matched with a similar pace to optimize the private investment that will also be needed to achieve that digital decade target. In addition, to ensure our resilience, security and competitiveness, we believe there are two things that will make a difference. First, that the deployment of transformational 5G is at the top of the political agenda, like it is in all other regions. And then secondly, every policy decision must be assessed against whether it accelerates the deployment of secure and resilient networks. I'm confident that everyone in this room has a shared objective, that the next decade delivers inclusive, sustainable economic growth whilst ensuring security and resilience of our European economies and societies. At Vodafone, we're determined to use our local and regional scale, to build the European digital ecosystems that will help achieve this objective. And we know we can only do this in partnership with government. So I'm really happy that we are facilitating the session today between public and private sector. There are really challenging times now and ahead of us. But with our collective willpower, shared values, I'm sure Europe will emerge more resilient, more secure, and an exporter of both European values and European value. Thank you.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Many thanks for your comments there, Nick, and some interesting insights there on the EU's digital decade targets in particular that I'm sure we will hopefully get the time to talk about a bit more as part of the next segment of today's session. And Margrethe Vestager is the current European Commission Executive Vice President for a Europe fit for the digital age, and of course previously held the position of European Commissioner for Competition from November 2014, after having served her time in Danish politics as Minister for Economic Affairs, and prior to that as Education Minister. Please give a round of applause to Executive Vice President Margrethe Vestager. Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you. Wonderful. Welcome,
Thank you.
Executive Vice President, and thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy schedule for joining us here. Of course, there are many policy questions for us to get into a bit later on, particularly things like the DMA after last week's successful adoption, but I think it would be remiss of us to not obviously start with the subject of the great tragedy unveiling on Europe's eastern front at the moment in Ukraine. And this is something that you have called a new Cold War for the 21st century. And I mean, many people are wondering now what world will be born from Russia's ever-increasing isolation from the West. We're coming to terms with, of course, a broad new sanctions regime against Russia with a likelihood of more to come. What's next in terms of Europe's strategy amid the current climate?
We don't know what will happen in Ukraine. We know the human tragedy. We see how the cultural heritage is being destroyed. We see how tractors are attacked on the fields, how grain is being burned to destroy the sowing for the spring and the harvest for autumn. So we see things that are awful, that we know of, so that we can act against. And I see incredible gestures of kindness and generosity. We just heard about Vodafone enabling people to get in touch. And I think that should really not be underestimated, because when you have to flee, well, the most important thing is that those who are left behind, that they know that you're safe and that you can connect with them to know what is the state of their situation. And you see so many Europeans opening their homes. I think that is not only heartwarming, that is also encouraging, as is the bravery and the courage of the Ukrainians themselves. So first things first, I think for Europe to solve problems, to be helpful, to use everything we have to do the right thing in so many different circumstances. In the college meeting today, it was basically a table round of colleagues reporting of what is being done, humanitarian aid on ground, refugee children getting to school in the European country where they are. The response to increasing food prices in North Africa, the collection of evidence of war crimes, you know, everyone doing their part to help out. So what might come from this is a different sort of reckoning of the European cohesion at a completely different level as to what we have seen before. In defense, in cyber defense, in some of the things where we may have been a bit hands-off, where it becomes more obvious that we have much more in common and much more to do together, as we saw in the pandemic, where also the Commission took action, pragmatic, practical, to find solutions, first on the vaccines, on the green lanes, then on the Recovery and Resilience Fund. And because of that, being able to establish, for instance, HERA now, so that we are better prepared for the future. So I think that is what one should look for, is how can pragmatical, practical action on ground sort of make us see what would also be useful for the future.
That's interesting. And the points there on with regards to resource sharing and how maybe we can create a more harmonized relationship regarding communications networks, cybersecurity with Ukraine is something that's particularly interesting. We heard earlier on about Vodafone offering free calls to Ukrainian citizens, to their loved ones back home. I just wondered if the Commission had considered establishing some sort of a roaming-free zone between the European Union and Ukraine. I mean, for those refugees, obviously, who are in Europe now and are trying to get back in touch with their loved ones back home.
Well, this is not something that you can do in our institutional setup sort of overnight. So, of course, it is so encouraging to see how so many then telcos, now tech companies, have stepped up and stepped in, indeed with free SIM cards, with calls, with data availability, so that people coming here can act as if they had free roaming. And I think that is really encouraging, because then you see the industry sort of paving the way for what might be a next phase. Because even when we act really, really fast, we cannot act as fast as what companies have done in basically days or weeks.
And we heard a bit earlier on about the 2030 digital decade targets, of course, these ambitious new goals for digital skills, connectivity, capacity building. Are they still on track, or will they be disrupted in any way as part of the current crisis?
I think, if anything, they'll be accelerated. Because neither the digital transition nor fighting climate change can stop, because digitalization continues. You know, they are still coding all over this planet, and CO2 doesn't care about war. You know, effects are the same. So we have no room for sort of saying first war and then the others. No, we need to do basically everything at the same time. And I see how first the energy crisis, accelerated by the war, sort of makes the green transition even more topical. We need to accelerate the entire rollout of renewables to get independent from Russian gas. And when it comes to everything digital, to increase our cybersecurity, cooperate on making sure that we are cyber secure, and of course being able to do that more on our own. We need to accelerate that rather than to say, no, we don't have the time, because this is the momentum, and this is when the funding is available, for instance, for digital skills in the Recovery and Resilience Fund.
And of course, it's not only a war that is being fought out in the streets and through the villages and the towns of Ukraine, it's also an information war. And we have seen swathes and swathes of disinformation garner more momentum across online social networks. And in the context of obviously current policy talks regarding the Digital Services Act, there are rumours that the Commission has pitched a new crisis management mechanism for dealing with disinformation in exceptional circumstances. What can you tell us about this? And does the issue of disinformation more generally become more pronounced in these so-called exceptional circumstances that we're seeing now?
I think sort of the most important first principle is to distinguish between freedom of expression and media plurality and what we see right now. Because what we see is a weaponizing of media. We see sort of old-school propaganda, old-school manipulation. It's part of the war chest. And I think it's fully legitimate to act directly against it. You know, Russia Today and Sputnik, we sanction them. So it's not via legislation about media that we deal with that. No, it's a direct sanction. And I think it's important to distinguish, and I hope Vera will forgive me for telling the story, but you know, she's next to me in the college room. She knows firsthand what it's like to grow up when you do not have media plurality. She's the first one ever to say, no, calm down, you know, there's nothing we need in Europe but media plurality. It's the first principle in democracy. In this situation, she was the first one to say, we need to do something. Because this is not about media. This is about the scrupulous manipulation of people, of their minds, of their hearts, of seeing what is the truth on ground. So I think it is important to have this provision when you are in the category of what is a war chest and being able to work against it. We're still discussing and finalizing, because obviously it has to be really closely circumscribed, because we are in this category and not anywhere near media plurality and freedom of speech issues.
And regarding, I mean, the response from some of the big tech social networks during the outbreak of war, what role do these platforms play? And would you agree with the Ukrainian government that these companies should do more to withdraw from the Russian market?
Well, that is difficult for me to assess. A lot has been done in order to withdraw, to prevent the download of apps that would access propaganda. I think it's for everyone to keep considering what could be done more, because we see how sort of disinformation spreads also to some of the countries that will be hit by food shortages, for instance. That they are being told that the war is the fault of the Europeans. So the Europeans, they don't care about the food shortages that will enter your countries. And that is sort of a trickle-down or trickle-out effect of the war in itself. Probably, or it might be well planned and part of the entire concept of destabilization. And here I think it's really important that we act as fast as we have done, showing that all the Putin investment in European diversion, in European splitting up, in European polarization, in investing in right-wing, that's no way we will accept it. We will not accept to be polarized by manipulation via social media.
And what sort of work is there going on at the moment in the Commission with regards to, of course, so now RT and Sputnik have been stopped in the EU, but to a certain extent you can still access their services, I believe, via certain online means. But are they using different methods now in order to spread their malicious disinformation to the EU? Are they looking for other means? Are they doing it in forums? I mean, do you think their strategy will adapt, and do you think we have to then adapt alongside it?
I think there's no way that we can say done and dusted, that was it. Because there will be all kinds of maneuvers to try to circumvent, which also means that the sanctions are living creatures. We need to follow very closely to see that they are effective, and if there are found loopholes, then to close them.
But how do you analyse the efficacy of those sanctions in particular? Because it strikes, you know, many of us that Putin is just headstrong on pursuing this war single-mindedly. It doesn't appear that the economic sanctions at least yet, are having any effect on his kind of drive to pursue his objectives.
Well, I do think that the sanctions are effective on ground. That we see with no but and nothing withdrawn. No, it has a very strong effect on ground on the Russian economy. Whether or not that influences sort of what Putin is thinking about the war in Ukraine, that of course is very difficult to say, because obviously it's a completely different rationale. Because the European Union is built on the very simple rationale that peace provides for prosperity and progress, and war doesn't, because we have seen that play out I don't know how many times in Europe. So obviously he's on a completely different line of thinking. But as a union, as we are a peaceful union, we are a union built on the rule of law. These are our tools. And I think it's important to use the tools that we do have in order to see what can be done to stop the financing of the war.
Okay. I'm going to turn to a couple of questions now that have come in on Slido. And just a reminder for everyone else in the audience as well, do log into Slido, sli.do, and send us your questions there using the hashtag #PoweringTheDecade. We have one here at the top that has received 5 favourable votes, so obviously a very popular question here. And this comes from Andre, who asks, how can we ensure the digital transformation doesn't widen the digital divide? And I assume that's the digital divide in terms of generations, geographical digital divide as well, the gender digital divide, especially regarding persons with, he specifies here, disabilities and older people.
I think the most important tool here is enabling people to acquire skills in all variety, both basic skills and expertise. Because if you can master what you're faced with, obviously you feel more confident, you feel more that you can engage in what the society has to offer you as a citizen. It's probably also one of the more tricky things. Because to make sure if you're 70 today, you may live, give or take, another 20 years. So there's no reason to say, no, I'm too old. This digital is not for me. Well, think about the digitization of the last 20 years. Imagine what will happen the next 20 years. Well, better get at it. And better member states figure out how to engage people 70 plus to make sure that they get at least basic skills. And second, how to make sure that the way we educate is sufficiently open. I think it's really important to think about digital experts in agriculture, digital expert in energy, digital expert in mobility, digital experts everywhere, and that we can recruit people based on their passion of agriculture, of energy, of mobility, instead of having it sort of go, you have to be digital from the start. Because it scares away some people. They say, no, it's an environment only for the few. And here we want to open for the many. Because otherwise, none of our ambitions can come true. If we do not master it, we will only be takers. And we need, from a European perspective, to shape much more technology.
Okay. Keep those questions coming in on Slido, please. Coming back to perhaps some of the more policy flavour of the day type subjects. Obviously, last week you rubber-stamped the landmark Digital Markets Act, which lays out new do's and don'ts for so-called gatekeeper platforms in the digital economy. One of the frustrations that has since emerged from certain quarters of the European Parliament is the fact that could potentially take over 2 years for platforms to be brought in line with these prohibitions and obligations. I think MEP Andreas Schwab said in the Internal Market Committee earlier this week that it could be as late as mid-2024 before platforms actually start to come into line with the rules. Why do we have such a long, drawn-out period here?
Well, I think you should ask, how can this happen so fast? Because what we are doing is going to be really complicated for a number of those businesses. And we are ready, we have a stable text, to start discussing what to do, how to do it, and this is when you should be ready to do it. In order not to see first designation and then we can start talking. No, we are ready to start talking basically as of now. Because we need, of course, to enable companies who think they will be designated to start aligning first their mindsets and then, of course, their engineers to get change done on ground. And, of course, the engineers, they need the instruction from the CEO to say, well, this is how we're going to change our business models. This is how we're going to change how this is going to work. And because of that, of course, I hope that if we have the entry into force after the publication of in the official journal by maybe 1st of October, then it will come into force by late October, then hopefully we can have compliance by early 2024.
Okay. And on this subject, actually, in terms of holding counsel maybe with some of the big tech platforms that may come under the scope of these rules, you had talks today in Brussels, of course, with Sundar Pichai, the head of Google. Digital Markets Act was allegedly on the agenda. Did they raise any concerns? Did they speak about how they would have to update their products and services? What was their response to last week's adoption?
Well, you know, it's really rare that, as I said to one of your colleagues, not of Politico, but of another media, that we have this game that you ask me about this meeting that's going to happen, and then I say, oh, but the meeting has not happened, so I can tell you nothing. And then when you ask me after the meeting, oh, I say, yes, the meeting has happened, but it's private, so I can tell you nothing. So in knowing I was going here, we made the agreement that I could say a bit. And the bit that we agreed to say was exactly that, yes, we were discussing the DMA. How to get started with what to do, when to do, how to do it, in order to meet these big expectations by the co-legislators.
Yeah, and I think that is an exact quote of the paragraph I received from the Commission spokesperson service immediately after the Sundar Pichai meeting. So there is indeed great harmonisation within the Commission services there as well. Enforcement. So again, I mean, there's been the notion of having 80 members of staff, not new members of staff, as far as I know, in the Commission, who will be working on enforcement of the Digital Markets Act. Is that enough?
Well, how the finer detail will be made, of course, remains to be seen. But I think one should not insist that it should be new. I think it's really important that we draw on the experience among our people, because they have a very long experience in what is happening in these fields, and that we can put together a task force, a big one, with the competences of what is needed. Because a lot of different things are needed, from ensuring interoperability, to France conditions being lived up to the ban of self-preferencing. It's a lot of different insights that needs to come together. So I think it's really important that we can draw on people from different services to put together a task force to do this. But the enthusiasm is quite big. We're looking forward to this enforcement.
Okay, great. Going back to the point there on interoperability, and for anyone that hasn't been following this that closely, there will, of course, be new rules on interoperability for messaging services, allowing the likes of Apple's iMessage and WhatsApp to communicate with one another. At least when this news was received in the United States, there were a number of publications that said, oh, security will be made incredibly vulnerable from these types of changes, and encryption will be threatened. I just want to give you an opportunity to respond to some of those criticisms.
Yes, the provision in itself will say that you can ask for interoperability and be granted it. It's not something that's an obligation that everyone should interoperate. There may be messaging services that would say, no, we want to be absolutely ourselves. We have no need to be interoperable with others. I think that's sort of a first principle, that this is not something imposed on you if you're not a gatekeeper. The gatekeeper is obliged to offer it if being asked.
Can one gatekeeper request another gatekeeper to be interoperable with its messaging?
Yes, I would think so, yeah.
Okay.
But within the services that are supposed to have interoperability. And the second thing is that, of course, we have been considering the technical points really, really carefully. But I think it is important that what is, I think, on top of everyone's mind, security is not used as a defense for something that is technically possible. We also have interoperability with mails. These days, we can all text message each other from different kind of subscriptions. And here, security issues, they are being dealt with.
Okay. And of course, many of these rules will apply to firms emanating from the United States. And I'd just like to turn back to Slido now with a question from Albert concerning the US-EU Trade and Tech Council, which obviously held its first meeting in September. You have a second meeting coming up, I believe, is it in May? Mm-hmm. In May. And Albert asks, how are its conclusions being implemented, the conclusions of the September meeting, and what do you expect to come from the second meeting?
Well, I think at this point in time, normally I should play down expectations to say, no, very difficult, and we don't really know. But when I look at the working groups and I see how they dig in, and when I see their enthusiasm for what they have sort of identified as short-term deliverables, and what they have identified as steps towards some of the long-term deliverables, I'm quite enthusiastic about it. Because, for instance, they're working on, we had this agreement on the approach to AI to focus on use cases and to focus, the most on high-risk use cases, trying then to say, well, how to understand that in real life. Can we develop sort of tools for businesses to deal with this so that they know on both sides of the Atlantic that go, this is fine. And actually, it has produced, I think, some results already, maybe a bit under the radar. But even though it may sound trivial, just the fact that you have met before, that you have each other's mail addresses and phone numbers, have also made the work on the sanctions being more intense and more and better, because there is this knowledge on both sides. And also those effects should not be underestimated. I think to some degree, of course, the war in Ukraine will also influence what we do. Some things will be more important than others, but that remains to be seen. There will be a stock-taking later for the preparation of the physical meeting in France for the 15th and 16th of May.
Mm-hmm. Was the TTC used, or has it been used at all, in the run-up to, of course, the recent announcement from President von der Leyen and President Biden regarding the new privacy shield? Were those discussions taking place also in the context of the TTC? And was that maybe one of the reasons that we were able to make progress in the last few months?
No, that we have held separate, because it's my colleague Didier Vreenders who's chef de file, and since I have nothing to do with it, I think I can praise him without any hesitation, because it is a really, really complicated file. And the fact that we now have a result, I think, shows the benefit of not interfering in a negotiation that was already ongoing when the Trade and Technology Council was established. So that has had sort of its own track, and the result that we have now have proven that this was the right way to go about it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Just to go back to the Digital Markets Act here, and of course for those firms accused of systematically non-complying with the rules, you now have these new provisions, including a ban on certain acquisitions. Is there anything more specific you can say about this particular provision, and how exactly does it supplement the Commission's current powers to block mergers? Because, of course, you already have those types of powers, but these are somewhat different and applied in a different context.
Well, within the DMA, the ban of acquiring other companies is something that can come as a sort of a sanction. If you're not complying in what you do already within your business conglomerate or whatever you'd call it, well, then you cannot acquire another business. So it's something that can come later in the process as a consequence to something that you have done or not done that you were supposed to do. When we do a merger review, well, that is sort of the review that comes from the fact that in the freedom of doing business, you can agree to acquire a company, or you can agree to make a joint venture, and then eventually we will assess if there are competition concerns arising from that. So it's two different approaches.
Mm-hmm. And specifically regarding the article here on systematic non-compliance, I mean, what does systematic mean? How many violations are we talking about?
I think we ended up with 2 of the same or similar within 8 years. Yeah.
Is it 3 within 8 years? Possibly that was what I heard, potentially. But,
I think so.
we can go and
Yeah, 3 is such a beautiful number.
Yes.
Well, not in telco mergers, obviously. But
Definitely. We won't go there. We won't go there. Of course, the DSA is trilogue negotiations are still going on. But what's the broader picture now with regards to the vision of the internet after the DSA and the DMA have been both adopted, implemented, effective? What does the next generation of the web look like with these types of regulatory instruments in place?
so you're asking about the dream?
The dream, exactly, yeah.
Well, I think that for me, one of the important things would be that democracy also have the might and the power in the digital world as it has in the physical world. Because so far digital developed as a small thing and then gaining more and more space, but with very little democratic oversight. And I think that is changing now. And for me, that's a good thing because, you know, for many people, you know, your digital world is 6, 7, 8 hours per day. So it's not a detail that if you're without democracy in 1/3 of the day. So I think that is a very important fundamental. And the second thing is that with the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, what we have discussed and agreed and implemented in the physical world will also be a real thing in the digital world. That what is illegal, hate speech, incitement to violence, what have you, will be forbidden and actions will be taken. And that you have a dynamic, open, contestable market where any business with a great idea and enormous work ethics may actually make it to their customers. And those are our ambitions for the physical world. And if we can make that come true also in the digital, I think we have achieved something.
And will you still be present in the Commission to see the fruits of your labour implemented?
Well, I'm there for this mandate at least. I think you're suggesting that I should have 5 or 6. No, we actually think that we can be effective also on a short time frame.
Okay. I just want to turn back to some of the questions now coming in thick and fast on Slido. We've got about a couple of minutes left. We have one here that looks like it's, again, related to the digital decade targets, connectivity, potentially here from Megan Richards. And Megan asks, Wi-Fi is very important for driving digital development, particularly for SMEs and less advantaged populations. How will the EU ensure adequate access to Wi-Fi? And maybe this is a question specifically we can frame in the context of connectivity patches across Europe's rural areas, for example.
No, but I think it's a good question because it addresses something that is fundamental, but that we sometimes stop thinking about because we think, oh, everyone has the connectivity they need. Now we need sort of the broadband rollout. We need sort of the really good fiber connections. But we still have the program of ensuring that there would be Wi-Fi available in public squares, in libraries, where you have access. Because it's not just good that there is Wi-Fi where you need to pay to be or where there is restricted access, but also in open spaces that you can find access to Wi-Fi there. And I think it goes quite well, these programs, with the rollout of connectivity embedded in the recovery and resilience plans, where you see a lot of connectivity ambitions, where you see the ambition to do also satellite connectivity for areas where it's not possible with a fiber or broadband connection. So I think a number of different things come together to secure that you can, for real, connect.
Great. Megan, I hope that answers your question there. I'm being told that we are rapidly coming to the end of today's session. We've heard a lot about the dream of the DSA and the DMA and what the next iteration of the internet possibly could look like. We've also heard about how the current crisis may actually accelerate Europe's digital transition, whether or not this will happen in practice, I guess we will have to wait and see, leading up to, of course, the end of the decade. That brings us to the end of today's...
Can I say...
One more?
Because everyone is asking, what can I do? You can do two things. Control your own and your teenager showers. And when you turn off the water, you say, take that, Putin. And second, you can give them incentives to dig into tech. We really, really need every gender, every generation to say, maybe it's this spring I should learn something new. Because that is the really, really hard strategic barrier to make all our ambitions and also our dreams come true. We need to master it, and it's for everyone.
Wonderful. A couple of lessons there from Executive Vice President Margrethe Vestager. And a round of applause, I think, is due there for taking the time out of her busy schedule today. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much. So we are now required to swiftly depart the stage, making way for our first panel session of the afternoon, which is being led by our newly crowned Politico Pro editor, Nick Vinokur.
Where we are. Microphone turned on, that may help. Thanks for following so far. As Sam said, I'm Nick Vinokur. I'm Politico's pro editor, overseeing the different verticals, but I was the tech editor until not too long ago, so I knew what was going on in that chat. I'm delighted to invite member of European Parliament Dita Charantsova, who's actually the Vice President of the European Parliament, up to the stage with me, and also Joachim Reiter, Vodafone's Chief External and Corporate Affairs Officer and member of the Executive Committee. Thank you so much for being here today. That was a really interesting chat, and obviously we're in the middle of this global news event that is kind of unavoidable and overshadows everything. So I want to talk about how this crisis is going to affect Europe's digital ambitions and the decade, and I think we can get into some of that with both of you. But I wanted to turn to you first, Dita. We heard from Ms. Vestager about how even now, in the discussions on the Digital Services Act, this big content law, some adjustments may be in order to take into account the challenges that have been thrown up by the Ukraine crisis. Could I ask you just, to run us through your thoughts on what might need to change in the Digital Services Act to reflect this new world we're in?
Thank you very much, Nick, and good afternoon to everybody. Well, as you know, we are negotiating the Digital Services Act. Tomorrow we have yet another round of negotiations. It looks it won't be the last one, so you will have a lot to write still in the couple of next days. And it's true that what we have seen with the war in Ukraine, and also the impact on our negotiations, because the Digital Services Act was never meant to be anti-disinformation regulation or legislation. But it's a first step, it's our first legislative attempt to regulate the harmful content on online, especially and only for the moment, for the very large online platforms. The goal of the Digital Services Act, as we all know, is about how to remove illegal content, but disinformation is something which is also needed to be regulated. So the proposal that was presented by the Commission already had it inside to ask the very large online platform to act, to do the risk assessment, etc. But now, with the war in Ukraine, we have a new proposal from the Commission, which is basically to have a power to ask the very large online platform to act. So it won't be only on the voluntary basis, on the goodwill of the big players to do something, but there will be, there will be a request made by the Commission. So in our language, how to translate it, so our Commissioner Thierry Breton will not call these very large online platforms, he will just order to act. So that's the difference, which I hope will be reflected in the final text.
And so that's going to be debated and discussed among yourselves before it's brought into the final text. Where is it now? Has the proposal been made already?
It's currently on the table as a proposal of the European Commission, which is being discussed and which has my support, and I'm sure it will have support of also many other colleagues in the European Parliament.
That's a remarkable change already in just a few short weeks, from sort of treating the platforms as neutral, obeying a law, to actually saying, well, we may have requests of them
in the crisis situation.
In the crisis situation. We'd be restricted to the Ukraine crisis situation. It wouldn't be a...
In the crisis situation, I don't know if we will go into details describing the crisis situation, but definitely the lesson learned is from the war in Ukraine.
Right, right. Well, that's a fascinating example. I want to turn to you, Joachim Reiter, my countryman, as I've just learned. We're both Swedes. You can tell with him, probably not with me. At Vodafone, you're a huge country, and the huge company, and the Ukraine crisis has been first and foremost for most Europeans a refugee crisis. And we've also read so much about the talent, the engineering talent that exists in Ukraine, and which may be ending up in a lot of European countries. I wanted to start you off with that. What is Vodafone doing for refugees? Are you finding talent among those 2 million plus refugees streaming out of the country?
Nick made some references also to what we're doing. So I have the mixed pleasure to first coordinate our COVID response and now coordinate our Ukraine response. So it's
easy ones.
Yeah. But this one, of course, strikes a particularly emotional chord, I think, for many Europeans. And as was referred to, it's a broader European security crisis with enormous human suffrage in the process. So obviously our response has been, A, to support the refugees, being at the border post, receiving them, making sure they can charge their phones, giving them SIM cards, ensuring that they can contact their loved ones, but also for our very large, already pre-war diaspora of Ukrainians or people that know Ukrainians to be able to contact and have contact with their loved ones and friends and family in Ukraine. I think from our point of view, in terms of the next phase of the response, and obviously, yes, there is, you refer to it as talent, but we first and foremost need to make sure that they have accommodation, that they can put their kids into schools, that they can access the health care that they need, including mental health care. And of course, a number of the digital solutions, considering the volume of migrants that we're dealing with, are going to be pivotal for Europe to absorb that amount of people, and we are willing to partner with any government to make sure that they can access e-learning platforms, much like we did during COVID, when people had to not necessarily have the ability to go into school, but they still needed education. Similarly, to consult doctors, you can use that by our platforms. With respect to the actual recruitment, so yes, we have opened up our platform for job applications. We have received 800 applicants from Ukraine already. We're already in the process of recruiting Ukrainians. It's an incredible talent pool that we see, and we think that part of the integration of Ukraine, and by the way, I must say, I need to congratulate the European institutions for using the Temporary Protection Directive, because it actually allowed us to offer jobs, contrary to other refugee crises where we didn't have that opportunity. In this case, it allowed us to move really fast to make sure that they can apply for jobs and utilize their unfortunate diaspora in Europe as a way of getting integrated and to be able to provide for themselves. But finally, I just want to say, remember all the people that are still struggling to maintain the network in Ukraine. So all the courageous people that are rebuilding bomb base stations. As Vodafone, we're also donating equipment. We're having constant communications and discussions how we can support. There's even a company in Ukraine called Vodafone Ukraine, which we're obviously supporting through this very, very difficult period. And that may include, and we have had discussions, that we will allow them, or they are trying to evacuate some of the staff. So we're making also available some office spaces of Vodafone across Europe, so that if they choose to run their network from Europe, we are willing to support them with that. And that's another way to make sure that we are making the best use of their talent.
Thanks. That's good to hear, and that's a big change that can actually apply for jobs in Europe. We are here to discuss the digital decade and our ambitions. This has been a major disruption to business as usual in Europe. Europe was already running behind on certain digital infrastructure goals, on the rollout of 5G. What's your prognosis, your prediction on those goals? Are we going to be slowed down in rolling out 5G in Europe even further as a result of this? And are we going to simply have enough investment to power this new rollout? Mm-hmm.
Well, first I should say the digital decade targets are the right ones, and they become more important than ever. Never forget also that the power of European stance and unified stance, including the sanctions, come from our economic power as a union. That economic power is driven by the fact that we are leading in a number of technologies. Unfortunately, with respect to digital technologies, that is no longer the case. So it's right to put the bar very, very high for 2030 for the union, but we have to also be honest, we have a long way to go. So one of the things that we have done is that we basically have looked at the EU Recovery and Resilience Facility to make sure how much will that be able to cover the gap. And the whole idea of the EU funds is not to splash taxpayers' money onto private companies, but to unlock matching private investment. So it's supposed to crowd in private investment, and that's the right approach that the EU has taken. The challenge, however, is that EU private investment in digital and in connectivity, including 5G, is subpar or suboptimal for the ambitions that the EU has set. And that situation is going to get even worse with the war in Ukraine, because with raising inflation, potential recession, or interest rates hikes, plus disruption of supply chain, energy price hikes, companies are going to struggle to invest more. So we're going to have to dig much, much deeper, both in the private sector, in partnership with government, be prepared to look at the full toolbox that we have at our disposal and ask ourselves the question, if we were already struggling pre-war and with the deteriorating economic situation, we're going to have to be more radical and more courageous in how we revamp and unleash private investment. And by the way, I think we have that opportunity, for example, starting with energy transition. Digital is a massive enabler of an energy transition in Europe. A lot of us companies with high energy prices are now reopening our business cases to invest in energy generation and renewables, to invest in energy reduction measures so that we increase our energy efficiency. We are ready to make those investments should there be a willing partner on the government side to co-invest with us behind it.
As things stand now, if there's no change in policy, do you think that the rollout of 5G will be delayed, and about how long?
Let's be really clear on Europe's starting point. China today, this year, will have 60% population coverage of the transformation of 5G, the 5G that allows for all the industrial applications. Europe, pre-war, was about to be 10 years behind China already. So it's not an option for us to delay things further. The only option remaining for Europe's future prosperity and competitiveness is to solve the conundrum of why we're already 10 years late and try to reduce that to 5 years, 3 years, or 2 years. Now, that's the level of radical rethink we need.
Right, but it could be longer than 10 years is what I'm hearing. I want to turn back to you, Ms. Charanzova, on sort of a little bit of a more political scale. My colleague Sam was speaking to Mrs. Vestager about transatlantic dialogue, and I know you're familiar with this because you're up front on so many digital files. I was just curious in your sense of whether there's a sense of renewed urgency in the transatlantic dialogue amid the Ukraine crisis, that on long-standing disputes across the Atlantic, perhaps this is something that will spur greater or faster action. There's a number of files where things are held up. What's your sense of the state of transatlantic dialogue?
Well, we know Joachim for centuries. The first time we met, it was, I think, 2007-8 here in Brussels. At the time, we had the Czech presidency and the Swedish presidency was about to come. And even at that time, we were already brainstorming what we should do with the US. Because what was clear that we need to create more transatlantic agenda, to create common rules, which comes also to digital, but also how we can really remove the barriers for our companies. And I think with the war in Ukraine, it became even more crystal clear for everybody that if we want to, that the world in the future will be divided. And our only chance as Europe is not to have isolated Europe island. It's to work with our allies, like-minded countries. And the first country on this list for me is the US. I was a big advocate of the TTIP in the past. Well, I don't think we have a chance to take it from the freezer, but definitely now there is a window of opportunity, of a new opportunity, how to embrace our relationship with the US. From digital to energy to digital. And we have to speed up. We have to speed up. I don't want to spend in the parliament yet another 5, 6, 7 years discussing the potential framework of this relationship. I want to see an action.
Right.
Could I build on this? Dita should get credit for the beef hormone deal we did with the US, but from our past sins. No, there's a very important thing here. What we're missing many times in Europe is the understanding that the scale, actually, of many of the challenges we face requires almost a transatlantic response. I'll give you a concrete example. 5G will unleash a massive proliferation of IoT connections, so the economy of things, which is a huge transformation of our society, enabling smart cities and stuff like that. It's also proliferation of attack vectors. It's no point in having European standards on hardware and software and IoT without having it with a mindset of trying to have collaboration on a transatlantic basis. And the Department of Homeland Security is already having a full program around standards and certification for IoT. It would make utter sense under the new institutional framework to have collaboration with the United States to actually plug in those parallel processes so that we get the benefits of the transatlantic combined market for the future of IoT. Same goes for many technologies. So I see a lot of opportunities if we manage to think that in the world that we will find ourselves post-war is one where we need to have closer collaboration, more collaboration on standards, co-creating those rules and those regulations, but also those innovations that will drive our combined competitiveness.
Last word, Dita, do you think in the context of maybe the Transatlantic Tech and Trade Council, could there be a dialogue on content? Could we come up with a joint framework on content rules? Is that something you'd be interested in?
Well, I think here the European Union has already advanced a lot.
Very far.
But at the same time, when I meet my American counterparts, they are discussing the same issues. So my vision or my dream, you started with the dream, so my dream would be that the end result is the EU-US framework. Okay. I think since we are really advanced in this discussion, it will be built up on what we are doing in Europe. But I see that there is still space, potential to address these issues together with the US.
Excellent. Thanks so much to both of you. This was a quick chat, but we had some great points here about new things to expect in the DSA, taking into account the need to address crisis situations. We had a bit of a warning on the rollout of 5G in Europe, the need for investment, lest we fall much further behind China in rolling it out. And we've just had a call right here from Ms. Charantsova on a EU-US framework for dealing with urgent content questions. Thanks so much to both of you. And let's see what I've got here next. I will pass the microphone over to my colleague, Peter Heck, who is next up on stage and is going to moderate a discussion on powering the recovery. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Pieter Haak. I'm a technology reporter at Politico's tech team. We already arrived at the last panel of this afternoon. And for this last panel of the event, we're going to talk about the recovery. Because during the pandemic, funds were made available to make sure that Europe, and especially European companies, could get back on their feet. So now it's time to take stock of this recovery. Because of course you can speak about the recovery and you can plan the recovery in Brussels, but of course it needs to happen on the ground as well. So where are we right now with the recovery? And what more do we need besides money? Do we need to train skills? Is there a need for connectivity? And given the recent developments, we will also talk about what will happen to the recovery now. Now another economic recession looms because of the war in Ukraine. Today, to discuss that, I'm joined by three excellent panelists. That's Maria Teresa Fabregas Fernandes. She's Director of the Recovery and Resilience Task Force at the European Commission. Welcome, Maria. We have also Julie Galland. She's the Deputy Director for Space, Electronic and Software in the Directorate General for Enterprise at the French Ministry for Economy and Finance. Welcome, Julie. And we also have Sebastiano Tofaletti. He's Secretary General of the European Digital SME Alliance. Thank you all for being with us and welcome. For those online and in person, remember to tweet about the event using the hashtag #PoweringTheDecade and #LivePolitico, and you can ask questions, of course, via Slido. It's also important to note that there is a poll question that you all can answer. The question is, how will local SMEs benefit from the recovery? And you have three options. The first option is it important to give direct support to companies? Is it important to give indirect support via connectivity? Or do we have to give support via skills? So let's dive right into it. Maria, maybe let's start with you at the Commission. Let's go back a little bit to the summer of 2020. We still remember that the pandemic was raging through Europe, but the European Union had plans to power the recovery. It has this big funds, the Recovery and Resilience Funds. There was the Recover Task Force that has been set up. Can you maybe walk us through the initial thinking by the European Commission, how the fund was initially envisioned and how it was established?
Well, as you all know, and good afternoon to you all, and you mentioned, Peter, there was a key European summit in the summer of 2020 when it was decided to create this mechanism, the Recovery and Resilience Facility. And what was clear from the start was that this was not an emergency tool. It was what it says, Recovery and Resilience Facility, meaning that it would provide funds to the member states in order to transform their economies, in order for the member states to recover, but to become more resilient. And this is the reason why there are key legal requirements in the plans for the member states to implement, address the country-specific recommendations that are more of economic, structural, and social perspective. Also goals on the digital transition, goals on the green transition, and reforms and investments. It's not only funds for investments, but also reforms in order for these investments to have a long-lasting impact. So the idea was not an emergency tool, but a transformational one.
That's important to keep in mind, the transformational tool. Let's turn to you, Mrs. Galland. Of course, France as one of the big EU states. I guess for an EU state, this feels a bit like an exercise in matchmaking, because you at the national level have a good eye on the needs that certain companies have, and then there is the support and the funds coming from Brussels. What was actually the strategy and the approach of France to match those, well, the needs and the support coming from Brussels?
Yes, thank you. I would say that what showed the crisis, and during the crisis, we have shown that how much digital solution and digital application as empowering our resilience in the society, especially to the continuation of business, to all companies, and especially for small SMEs, for craftsmen, shops, developing e-commerce, click and collect. So there is one diptych, which is one step, an axis of development that is getting those technologies and solutions be accessible and empowering the resilience of everyone on the territory. So which means making possible of transformation from, for example, commerce and shops and so on and so forth to adopt solutions, but also to continue the deployment, for example, for the fiber to get everywhere on the territory in France. And of course, when you get so much resilience and trusting the digital solution and technologies for your resilience, you get aware that being not autonomous or not mastering those digital solutions is also a kind of fragility for future resilience. And of course, question about how those digital solution is trustworthy, is secure for your business, but also how they are designed and corresponding to your own ethics and about data and data privacy data, as Mrs. Vestager explained. So we have launched through the Recovery Fund big support to development of technology on digital, especially on some kind of strategies about, I would say, several pillars, which is quantum, cybersecurity, 5G, electronics, and cloud. And among most of them, I've cited the biggest one. So we are now developing some strategies supporting the development of the ecosystem, participating to the big initiative at a European level, such as IFCs, that you know, so there's a big program at European level that enable us to notify support to R&D and first industrialization. So there is 2 of them, which is on cloud, that is roughly being pre-notified, and the one on electronic and connectivity, which have been pre-notified.
So we can conclude that France identified a few key areas, yes, and aligned with the European priorities. Mr. Toffoletti, of course, this all sounds very good. We have this transformational tool, we have certain key areas identified in certain member states. But you, as the SME Alliance, you're close to European SMEs, sometimes struggling because of the pandemic, I can imagine. What's your take on this approach? And because we have this money that captures the attention, but what's really needed by European SMEs?
Okay, thank you, Peter. Well, you mentioned the pandemic. Indeed, as it was said in the previous, by the previous speakers, also before this panel, the pandemic has been a great boost to Europe's digitalization. If you look at SMEs, indeed, this was the chance for many of the SMEs in traditional sectors to start using and digging more into digital technologies. Now we have the Recovery and Resilience Facility, the national plans, and this is also another big boost, right, to digitalization. What we think is what is important, and I probably will be a little bit provocative here, is also to set the right strategy, the right narrative, okay? Because when we think about SME digitalization, we need to understand what we are talking about, okay? The wording we hear, especially from the US, but unfortunately lately also from the colleagues of the Commission and even from the OECD, when we speak about SME digitalization, there is very often an equivalence which is made with the access to digital tools, okay? And this wording, we believe, is a little bit problematic, because this wording misses a strategy, okay? The big question, to make it very simple, is do we want to become users of technology, or do we want to become makers of technology as Europe? And SMEs cannot be seen only as users of technology, right? We want to be seen as makers of technology. So when we think about the key objective for SME digitalization is access to digital tools, which, frankly speaking, equals to access to platforms, right? I think we have a problem. If we accept that wording, even in the TTC discussions, coming from the US, then I think we have a problem.
But let's maybe throw back the ball to the ladies here in the panel, because that's interesting, of course. Is there maybe a too narrow vision on when we speak about connectivity? Are we users or are we makers of technology? Mrs. Fabregas.
Well, what I can reply is based on what we see in the national plans, in the 22 national recovery and resilience plans that have been adopted by the Council. What type of measures we find there. And we find, of course, investments on connectivity, as you highlighted, but we find also digitalization of SMEs, but also lots of digital skills, which help SMEs, if we talk about the SMEs environment, and investments on the high tech, on the new technologies also. And it's clear also something that I was discussing with Sebastiano before this panel, the fact that all measures in the national recovery and resilience plans have to comply with state aid rules. And in these cases, it means that some of the big measures that are in the national plans have to include a component for SMEs. And this is something that will reinforce the SMEs' value, no, in terms of the digital transformation. And of course, as highlighted before, reforms are key also in the area of the digital transformation, and we see lots of reforms to remove barriers to 5G, also reforms in terms of curricula, which are key at all levels, and also on the modernization of public services. So all in all, in terms of connectivity, in the plans, to be precise, we have in fixed and 5G around 30 billion euros in these 22 plans that have been adopted. To say that the Recovery and Resilience Plan are one of the contributions to finance these developments, because there are other EU funds, but there is, of course, the crowding in of the private investment, which is absolutely necessary to achieve the goals also of the digital decade.
Yeah, maybe a question for you, Mrs. Galland. We've seen in this recovery and resilience plans that 20% needs to be earmarked for digital. Do you think that's enough to be, to phrase Mr. Tofaletti, to be a maker of European of technology instead of a user of US platforms?
Yes. Well. If you, of course, the amount of investment, if you want to master all digital technology, is really huge. Whether you're speaking about being a new leader in cloud, or being a new leader, or to go on the battle of electronics components. But we have. Well, we are committed to gather a lot of, really a lot of amended support to go as far as we're able to get to our to support the objective of the Commission in the digital compass and in the chip stack, for example. So, whether 20% is enough or not, in fact, it depends also of the, I would say, the transformation of the attractivity of Europe compared to the other geopolitical power in the world that are mastering digital. And also the way of being able to gather also private investment on European soil. So that's maybe an achievable goal, and we have until 2030 to achieve it. So I guess that in the meantime, we will be able to go on and to work together.
So are you saying that for every public spended euro, there should be also a private
Of course, that's how it works, and especially if we are speaking about, I would say, a very competitive market. The private sector is supported by public sector, but of course, the main driver is private money at first, because it's aligned. Then it is aligned with a strategy and on business, and that makes it credible and to achieve its goals.
Mm-hmm. I want to throw in a question from the audience because it fits well with the discussion. It actually says, it's Bernardo Matos, who say, how can we maximize the value of every euro invested in infrastructure until 2026? That's something that is of concern, of course. Is our public money well spent? There are elections in France. I guess that's an issue there as well, the well spending of public investment. Maybe Sebastiano, what's your thought on that? When we're really using public money in local SMEs, how do we make sure that that's well spent?
Well, I think probably none of us has the secret recipe, for how to spend the public money to maximize the value. Or if you have, please mention it. But from my point of view, what I say is important is that we have the great potential, because there is big investment coming, both from the public and the private sector. We have the big potential to really unleash the potential of ICT technologies. Okay? The more we believe that technologies should be open, okay, and let me say even crowdsourced, okay, the more they are the property of everyone, the more they are not a silos, the more we can get out of these technologies, the more we can make Europe the maker of future technology, the more we can also achieve the green objectives, okay? Because if we have access to data, if we have connectivity, and it's very right to invest in connectivity, but we need also to have the access to the data produced by the devices, because if we have that, then ICT, software, artificial intelligence, and so on, the technologies can maximize the potential and really make the energy efficiency that are needed. But if we keep technologies closed, if we do not give access to data, think about two sectors that really consume a lot of energy. Cars, automotive, and building, houses, okay? In both sectors, if we keep the access to the data reserved to the original manufacturer or the energy supplier, the original manufacturer of a car or the energy supplier of a house, okay? If they are the only companies that have the access to the data, no one can invent anything, okay? And we have many SMEs in Europe that are very innovative and can invent a lot of things, can plug their own services on top of a house. For instance, I don't have access to the real consumption of my house, of my apartment, right? Yeah. If I had that, I will give the data, real-time data about my energy consumption to an independent company, probably an SME, which will offer good services, which will help me minimize my energy expenditure. And the same for cars.
That's of course something that will be addressed in the Data Act that was recently, well...
I hope so, yes.
Okay. You briefly mentioned energy efficiency, also car industry, an industry that is really plagued by a lot of problems at the moment. Because of course, we're still in the midst of the rollout of the recovery plans following the pandemic, but now with the war in Ukraine, tragic developments there might be another recession looming at the horizon. We have energy prices skyrocketing, general inflation going up, supply chain issues in different industries. There are three brief questions that I want to direct to the three of you. Maybe first, is there a need for new recovery plans or a tweak of the current recovery plans due to the current crisis? What should it look like if that's the case? And can companies be part of the solution of the recovery as well? Mrs. Fabregas, go ahead.
Yes, I will start. So as you know, at the beginning of March, 8th of March, the European Commission published the communication on Repower EU, precisely to take into consideration, in particular, the issues linked to the dependency on energy and the need to invest more in renewables and to improve the energy efficiency. And so there, in that communication, the recovery and resilience plans are mentioned. And why they are mentioned? Because, as you know, at least 37% of the plans are devoted to green, most of it to energy efficiency, to renewables, and also the fact that there is still an envelope, important envelope for loans of 220 billions, that it's still there for member states to be able to request them by drafting an addendum, an additional plan, as mentioned in the regulation. So this is one way for member states to find, as mentioned, also cohesion funds are mentioned, and it's a way through the use of the Recovery and Resilience Facility to use the loans for this type of investment. So that's key. Something that I would like to say, linked to the previous question about the EU approach, is that we have several cross-border projects in the plans, in particular important projects of common European interest that are very much linked to the question that was highlighted before, the need to work together on key areas such as microelectronics, clouds. European digital innovation hubs are key in order to develop this. And, for instance, the innovation hubs are also key in order to cope with geopolitical situation and other types of investment, meaning that all what we have in the plans adopted, the 22 that have been adopted now, helps to overcome the current situation also, but as said, there are additional funds that are available in terms of the loans in the Recovery and Resilience Facility.
But that's still an amendment to, an addendum to the...
Yes, according to the regulation, there is a specific mechanism to do, and it's, yes, kind of a modification of the plan to add new reforms and investments.
Can you already tell that this crisis won't be that disruptive, that there won't be any need for any new plans?
As said, we have a regulation with a facility, and it has not been completely used yet. So there is still funding available that can be used for the member states. Therefore, if this is still available, I think that at this stage, no one is considering.
Yeah. So I'll take that as a no new plans for that.
Well, no new plans, kind of amendments of the plans in the framework of the Recovery and Resilience Facility to take over the loans.
Let's turn to France. Do we need new recovery plans or tweak to the recovery plans?
Well, at least we have in France been coping with the urgency of due to this crisis, and the French government have published a very recently, I would say, an urgency plan to those companies who were suffering, and also to people that were suffering from the consequence of the Ukraine crisis, on focused on two big sector, which is agriculture and energy, of course, but also to everyone that had some impact about the consequence of export control or import control, and that were disturbing their business. So there is a measure about temporary leave for employees. There also some helps to be able to find other, I would say, markets in the world to export, and so on and so forth. So this is, I would say, more like an urgency measures. And what I would say is that first, we are still implementing and launching the mechanism and the programs on the first recovery plan. And we are comforting through this crisis, which is a very geopolitical disturbance, I would say that we are quite comforting in our choice in terms of digital support to technology to get more resilience through developing the ecosystem, whether it would be big company or SMEs that we are launching new technology, offering new technology and autonomous and independent European technology.
So this crisis makes the case for strategic tech autonomy?
I think it's comforting, yes, it's a comforting us to go on our strategy on our programs in digital.
Yeah, Mr. Toffoletti.
Well, yes, I can only concur. It makes a case for digital autonomy, indeed. You asked whether companies, the private sector, will have a role in this in recovering from the crisis that comes from the war? And the answer is clearly yes. I was discussing in these days with some of your colleagues at the Commission, and we are thinking of launching a challenge, a call to European companies to invent technology, digital solutions to mitigate the energy and raw material crisis. And I'm sure if we do so, we're going to have a lot of responses. We did the same at the start of the pandemic. We launched a campaign towards especially SMEs to propose digital solutions. And as we saw, really, this was a period in which many new digital solutions arise. Of course, we all are familiar with the big tech solutions, but I can guarantee that many citizens, many public authorities, and many companies also use solutions developed by local enterprises that are suited to their needs. And there is a lot that can be done through these technologies. So I'm sure that, yeah.
How should that work, that bottom-up approach to get solutions? I saw you were nodding, Mrs. Galland. So you concur with this approach?
Yes, totally. Yes, and we have some example of small companies that propose very disruptive and interesting tools by themselves to cope with so much crisis. And during it was a kind of, I would say, a very dynamic time during the COVID crisis, with a very spontaneous proposal to try to cope the crisis. I'm sure that there will be such a dynamic that can occur during this crisis.
Sorry, and not only so we can help to minimize the effects of the crisis, but we can also use it as an industrial strategy, no? To believe and boost in the capacities of our own industry, in view also of the digital sovereignty. Why not? So, it's in the hands of our leaders, especially our political leaders, to seize the opportunity, because the private sector is there and it is ready to grab the opportunity if it is offered an opportunity to contribute.
Yeah. It's a message to European leaders to look at it from both ways. We've been speaking a lot about the recovery and also a bit of how it is continuous crisis management lately. Of course, this all should lead to something. We have discussed already, or other panelists as well have discussed the 2030 digital targets. They're there about skills, connectivity, and other targets as well. Of course, we have seen these unexpected events like the war in Ukraine. Shall we start with the Commission's view? This targets and these unexpected events, how does the Commission keep the recovery on track? Are there certain moments from time to time that it's needed to check in and to see where the recovery is heading, not only here but also in the Parlement, to say?
Well, as the Executive Vice President mentioned, so the fact that now we have this war in Ukraine, the geopolitical crisis, doesn't mean that we are not pursuing the goals, and both the twin transitions, green and digital transition, are on top of the agenda. And as the other panelists were highlighting, not only on top of the agenda, but also providing solutions by the current challenges that we are having. So in this regard, with the plans, the recovery and resilience plans, we have a monitoring mechanism in terms of when the milestones and targets are achieved, and when the member state submits payment requests, the funds are disbursed. So for France and Spain, we have already disbursed the first payment request, meaning that we have a way to monitor the achievement of those milestones and targets. So with regard to the plans, for the moment, everything is on track at this stage.
Yeah, at this moment, of course, but in a few years, and in some member states, this might be a more daunting task to monitor where the money is going. How can the Commission make sure that this recovery and resilience funds is not just an ATM and that there is really follow-up on where this is going?
So some of you might have checked one of the Council implementing decisions on one plan, its respective plan. It's a document of more than 100 pages, sometimes even 300 pages, including descriptions of the reforms, investments, the milestones and targets that have to be achieved by the member states in a given time frame in order to be able to request the funds to the Commission. So we are checking every time a member state is sending a payment request, we are checking that all the elements have been complied with. So it's not an ATM at all. Member states have, it's a performance-based tool. Member states have to prove that they have performed in achieving, in fulfilling those milestones and targets.
Yeah. Ms. Galland, inside the member state, how is that organized to make sure that the right information makes it to Brussels and that this is kept
yes,
kept track of?
I can confirm you that we have put a strong process on it, because there is a. I've been asked on one of my programs whether if this money have been spent and if we have rightly achieved the goal and the program we have proposed to achieve, and so there is a good report. I would say. I guess every year, at least every year, and there is I would say a special guard that will be hired to prepare those reports at I would say at the national level to the Commission. So it is a very precise and complete exhaustive report that we do.
Yeah, and if we speak about a trajectory towards 2030, of course. When we enhance connectivity, when we train people with new digital skills, there are also, of course, certain threats to that trajectory. For example, when you have more connectivity, there is also more risk for cyber attacks. There is also the rise of algorithms and of AI, which might put certain skilled people again out of a job. What's the take from a member state when that plan is put together? How can you cope with that kind of unexpected trends?
Well, at least there is not a threat, but a very strong challenge that we are facing launching those big investment and in those dynamics is to being able to have the massive competence that will be here, so the talent to be trained in the future and to be able to get the future generation and the student to get into the digital area, and that's where we are facing this challenge and starting to take the measure on it, because we are going to train thousands and thousands people in would say, very high competence skills to answer, like you say, artificial intelligence, or with cloud supervising, or electronics as the most difficult or very high trend work. So. This is one of the biggest challenges we are facing in Europe. I think that this will be also, if we are able to develop those skills, one of a key element of attractivity of Europe. Because when you're listening to every CEO in digital, training skills is one of the key point to put their activity in a country and in a location. So that's a main challenge.
All right, let's keep that in mind. Mr. Toffoletti, when I speak to CEOs from starting companies, startup scale-ups, they really, when I speak about them to them about Brussels, they one of the things they always say, like, oh, there is so much regulation coming from Brussels. We have the DMA, we have the DSA, we have the GDPR, and they tend to use the word, it's such a burden. Yeah. What's your take on that? Because when we speak about the recovery, Europe wants to support its growing companies, but at the same time, they have the feeling that even if these regulations are well intended to create a level playing field, it sometimes feels that at the same time of the recovery and the support, it's a burden as well. How does that work together?
It's a nightmare, isn't it? Yes, we speak to many companies, many CEOs, and indeed, perception is often that there is too many rules coming out of Brussels. I have to say, in the case of the DMA, because you mentioned it, because it has just been approved, our community is extremely positive about it. Okay, because differently from the large majority, if not all, legislation which is known and in the last years has come out of Brussels, this is a very targeted piece of legislation. And this approach is unique, okay? If I can compare that with the GDPR, which certainly has been a very important exercise and we are all in favor, but the GDPR was trying essentially to target the abuse of that happens every day, even today, with our own data by the big platforms, trying to solve that, applying a one-size-fits-all legislation, more or less, that became a burden, became a huge nightmare for many small companies and many innovative startups as well. I'm not saying we did it wrong, because there are certainly many positive things in the GDPR, but in this case, in the case of DMA, the choice to go out with a targeted legislation, which is addressed only to a very few companies, which you can name, is certainly the right approach. Now, there are other initiatives which are probably a little bit more worrisome, at least from our point of view. For instance, there is an AI Act. We want to try to regulate the AI solutions in the market. And it is said we want to do that via standards, via compliance with European or international standards. And that, to me, is extremely worrying, because that means ex-ante compliance, and that means that we have not understood the way digitalization happens. As I was trying to say earlier, digitalization doesn't happen because you buy off the shelf a product. Yes, you can do that, right? Yes, you can buy, I don't know, you can buy a Facebook ads, or you can sell on Amazon, or you can use the Google suite. You can do that. That's the off-the-shelf product. But that is not going to give you any competitive advantage towards anyone else, because everyone uses them, right? So the real digitalization is a journey of innovation. It is reinventing the company business model in order to create value through technologies. It doesn't happen in 1 month. It happens in years, okay?
But can you make that a bit more specific?
The point is, of course, if you understand that, when you use AI is going to be a transformative tool that the company, the SME itself, together with some providers, it will develop. It will be a solution which evolves in the years, okay? And you cannot certify every time you make a change. And compliance with standards is this. Compliance is ex ante, and then you can go to the market.
But
right?
Do you mean that the current risk-based approach that is envisioned in the AI Act, is it the wrong one? Is it going to kill small business and small AI-focused business? It
is rightly so. It is an approach which has safety and security in mind, of course, very good, but it doesn't have an industrial strategy behind. It doesn't understand how technologies are, and it doesn't have a vision of Europe becoming a leader in the use of AI, in the development of AI.
Yeah. It's maybe a message for Brussels to keep in mind. I think it's time for us to slowly wrap up this debate. There were a lot of interesting takeaways that we can take home. I think one of them was Europe and the recovery plans are not an ATM. That's one important one to remember. The SMEs are ready to be part of the solution, and different member states are already envisioning the key areas where they want to make a difference. I'm not sure if I also can get back to the poll, to the results of the poll. Maybe I can. Oh, there it is. So there was an overwhelming support for more support for skills, 56%. So that's, as was mentioned by one of the panelists, a big challenge for the years ahead. So some food for thought for the panelists and for our audience. That was it. First of all, I want to thank our speakers. It's always a delight to have very different perspectives. I want to thank the audience for tuning in and to be here in the venue. If you have any feedback, please let us know at live@politico.eu. For people on site, there is still the delight of having a networking reception, so please sit tight. I also want to thank Vodafone, our partner, for making this event possible. And maybe one final thing I have to say, Politico has an AI and tech summit coming up on April 21st. And there will be very interesting speakers attending. For example, the Executive Vice President, Margrethe Vestager, will be there, but also other commissioners like Mr. Didier Reynders, and many more. This was Peter Haak for Politico Live, and thanks for tuning in. And give our speakers a round of applause.